Hello, good morning. I have called my contribution Empirical Evidence and Justifiable Assumptions, the positive effects of reading in a tableau, and you will see that what I will have to say connects a lot to what Luis and the representative of the ministry has said before. It's not necessarily the same, but it connects very well. The context is, and Luis has mentioned that in the project of Aldous Up, we try to harmonize European reading studies, but because if you want to make benchmarking, for example, you have to be sure that the figures that are produced in the different countries are really comparable with respect to how many time do you spend reading e-books, on listening to audiobooks, and so on. And in doing that, and we got pretty far with that, we identified that the main application area of these findings is reading promotion, because the top-level information of all that is that reading is a good thing and reading should be promoted. If you want to promote reading professionally, then you would have to say what the problem is in a situation as observed, and if you do measures and policies, then afterwards you would have to look if your measures and policies have been successful. And therefore, what you measure in a society with respect to reading has to be relevant to what you are up to. Since you can't measure reading effects, you have to find reading situations that are typical for certain effects. And then you measure how much time, for example, people are in these reading situations. And it all comes down, as I said, to the elementary unit of positive effects of reading, which are not measurable in a particular situation, but we only know that they exist, and then we have to relate them to reading situations, and then how important these reading situations are in a society before and after, for example, reading promotion measures and policies and measures. And we have written in the wider context of Aldous Up a white paper about that, and that's open source, so you can just look that up. I will talk about and a lot of that, but if not all, is from this paper about the positive effects of reading. I know there is a lot of research in the world going on, and one of the leading ones is Emanuele Castano, who will talk to you later. And we tried to bring some of that together on a rather high level to give an overall impression. And as I said, you can't measure positive effects of reading in a case. You can do experiments to find out that there are positive effects, but you can't measure the positive effects in a society, for example. For example, I would say you cannot say we implement a reading promotion activity that has imaginative capabilities as its objective. What you can say is we want to evoke imaginative capabilities. That's one of the positive effects of reading. And therefore, we promote reading situations that do evoke imaginative capabilities. And I have an ex negativo remark here. Probably the reading situation of reading social media conversation on a smartphone are not contributing that much to evoking imaginative capabilities. But this is only an hypothesis and has to be proven. As I said, we have two units. We have the positive effects of reading, and we have reading situations and typical reading situations, and they implement a few of these positive effects of reading. And a reading situation is described, as you know, by parameters like, for example, what is read, the book genre, for example. Is this read quietly or aloud? Is it a dedicated reading setup, or is it not? Is this kind of reading a ritualized part of life? If so, in which rhythm? What is the typical length of a reading situation, and so on? And for the purposes of what we did in this context, we came up with a few example reading situations, and I list here I think 6 or 8, but I have marked 3 of them in orange, and you can only concentrate on the orange one. A typical reading situation in a society is, for example, reading a borrowed genre fiction book like New Adult Romance or whatever in a printed book while commuting for leisure and reading for leisure. And there are things we are not so much going into it. For example, reading a bored classic of the national literature in a printed book in an armchair for leisure, which many people would describe as a very typical reading situation, but it's by far not the only, as we all know. Another typical reading situation, which is completely different from the one I just talked about, is reading educational media on a tablet and in school. And here's another one. We will hear more by Naomi Barron later about if it makes sense to talk about listening to an audiobook in the connection of reading. There are reasons against and reasons for, and I will not go into that. But since we here come from a perspective of book fairs and publishing houses, we also see that from an economical point of view. And from an economical point of view of a publishing house, audiobooks are the valorization of intellectual property, and they make about 50% of the business in some Scandinavian countries, so we better get the figures even if we know that it's not exactly the same. So this reading situation would be listening to a subscribed audiobook of a classic of national literature while running, also for leisure. And I will only give you a few examples, but cannot cover all of it. In our paper, we went through the literature and to the research there is with respect to positive effects of reading. For example, many studies say that reading has a positive effect because it enables basic participation. Then there were a few positive effects of reading that were so obvious that we didn't find evidence, and we still added them, and I have mentioned here in red as obvious prior assumption. And this one is, if you read, then this of course conveys some kind of knowledge, but I have not seen any studies, for example, that measure the conveying of knowledge by books as opposed, for example, by other media like video. Studies say that, and I've mentioned this positive effect before, that reading triggers imaginative capabilities, it elicits empathy and pro-social behavior. That's the corner where Emanuele Castano started basically the discussion a decade ago. Reading it helps to achieve or to maintain health and overall well-being. You might have heard about that. An extreme case of that is bibliotherapy. Books say trigger or a reason for social interaction. Another thing that did not get measured as far as we are concerned, and what we have found is reading can give aesthetic pleasure. It of course doesn't have to in any case. If you read a timetable, typically does not give you aesthetic pleasure, but it is one of the reasons why people read. Think of poetry, for example. And for example, in this case, a reader would interact with a book in its material form, and we're talking about building, the construction of language, but also layout or the material appearance of the physical product. And then, of course, if you read, then in a direct or indirect way, this will also have positive effects on the creative and cultural industry. You as a reader are probably not concerned with that. That's absolutely okay. But if you read a book, then either, well, let's just talk about printed books in this particular case, then you either buy a book, which creates turnover for booksellers and publishing houses, or you go to the library, then at least the purchase of the book by the library creates turnover of the publishing industry, of the book industry. And I will back that up with a few examples. We had talked about that reading is connected to triggering empathy. And there are also studies now, that this is the blue stuff, which go a step further by saying reading reduces preconceived ideas as well as prejudices. And now go to the orange material. There were studies that showed that there were reduced rates of homosexual prejudice and race bias after reading, or an induction of empathy and consequently reducing prejudices and stereotyping against Arab Muslims. Just to tell you that the categories we came up with positive effects of reading actually are based on studies. Here's another one which extends this way of arguing, namely it elicits empathy. That's what Castano-Kidd found out and started as a discussion. Then that was the previous slide. It reduces prejudices, but even a step forward there is, and sometimes it leads to active behavioral changes. And if you now go to the orange stuff, the participants who decided to donate to foundations that help affected people to cope with grief or depressions were more likely to do so when they had read narrative text than when they had read an explanatory text. This is a little bit different. It doesn't talk about reading or not reading. It talks about reading more ambitious, in this case, narrative stuff, as opposed to just factual statements. And this is the last slide of this type. I talked also about health and well-being, and there are studies that say, for example, people who regularly read books of any form are significantly healthier than non-readers. And in the other case, people who read an average of 30 minutes or more per week tend to be 20% more likely to have a greater life satisfaction. And now this is the outcome, basically, and the reason also why we did all this collection of the positive effects of reading. There are a lot of positive effects of reading, and if you want to handle them in, for example, reading promotion activities, then you would have to manage them in cumulatively. And this is just a proposal how you could do that. And when you get back to the title of my talk, I said that I talk about positive effects of reading as results of empirical work. We will hear more today about the assumption of many people, for example, Wexfo and also Aldous Up, that there is another very important effect of reading, namely that it sort of supports democratic mindset and is therefore a part of defending democracy. But there are no overall empirical studies that show that. And this is the final thing. You remember I had all these groups of positive effects all the way from participation to support of cultural and creative industries. And if you go into the studies, then they often say that different types of books, different genres, cover some of these positive effects more or less. For example, I assumed already that maybe reading a blog on a smartphone while commuting does not as strongly help to have creative ideas as, for example, reading an ambitious book in an armchair. And I have done that for these three reading, these orange marked reading situations. And if you see them as a synopsis, depending certainly also on the sequence of what I did, then you can see that the overall perspective on a reading situation that can be target of a reading promotion activity are very different with respect to the positive effects. Meaning, if you want to do a reading promotion activity, you better think about which positive effects you're targeting, and then you see or you think about which reading situations are best to elicit these positive effects, and that's what you do. And after that, you do another study, and then you will see if you were successful or not. My conclusions are the positive effects of reading are obvious, at least empirically, and they are evidenced. There are many of them, and they are they're very different, from supporting the cultural and creative industry to eliciting empathy or giving imaginative ideas. A systematic way to manage and mediate between those, and this is difficult, not least for reading promotion, is highly desirable, and this was a proposal. And then, as I said, if this is the key term, democracies depend on reading. If we want to make that happen, we need empirical work on the assumed additional positive effect of reading, which I here have called democratic mindset. We might come up with another term at some stage. And we would have to start with the indicators. How can you measure if there's a democratic mindset? And if you have seen some of them, then we might see that some of the other positive effects that had been covered already are very closely connected to that. I have not mentioned the top-level concept of critical thinking, but that's, of course, very closely connected to democratic mindset. In the meantime, develop powerful reading promotion policies and measures, including and considering democratic mindset, even if we don't have the empirical evidence yet, and do that fast and now. Thank you very much.